Jax's revenge domain. The radio crackled and Harvey Sterling's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. He fired me for refusing to lift a 12-ton steel beam onto concrete that hadn't cured properly. He thought he owned me because his uncle signed the paychecks. He was wrong. I was 150 feet up in a tower crane, and I decided to show him exactly what happens when you push a union man with 34 years of experience too far. My name is Russell Donovan, but everyone on the site calls me Russ. I'm 57 years old, been operating cranes since I was 23, started right out of high school when construction was booming and a man could make a decent living working with his hands. I know the difference between green concrete and cured concrete the same way a baker knows when bread is done. And I know that putting 12 tons of steel on concrete that's only been curing for 7 days instead of the required 28 is a recipe for disaster. The job site stretched out below me like a steel skeleton reaching toward the sky. We were building a 15-story office complex downtown, the kind of project that makes or breaks a construction company's reputation. From my perch in the tower crane cab, I could see everything. The concrete trucks lined up at the gate, the workers scattered across the lower floors like ants, and Harvey Sterling pacing around in his spotless hard hat, clipboard in hand, making everyone's life miserable. Harvey had been riding my crew hard for 3 weeks now, ever since his uncle made him project manager. The kid was 28 years old, had a business degree from some fancy college, and drove a BMW that cost more than my house. But he didn't know the first thing about concrete or steel or what happens when you cut corners on a construction site. I'd been watching this kid make mistake after mistake since he arrived. First, he tried to schedule concrete pours during a rainstorm. Then he wanted to remove scaffolding before the concrete reached proper strength. Each time, I'd had to step in and explain why his ideas would get someone killed. Each time he got a little more hostile toward me. "Russ, you copy?" The radio buzzed. I sighed and reached for the handset. Helen had packed me an extra thermos of coffee this morning like she always did when she knew I was going to have a difficult day. After 28 years of marriage, she could read my moods better than I could. "I copy, Sterling," I said, keeping my voice flat. "What do you need?" "I need you to pick up that beam and get it to the 15th floor. We're behind schedule and the client is breathing down our necks." I looked down at the steel beam in question. It was a massive H-beam, part of the main structural support for the top floor. The concrete pad it was supposed to sit on had been poured exactly 7 days ago. I had the pour logs right here in my cab. I always kept detailed records because I'd learned over the years that when things went wrong, the first thing management did was look for someone to blame. "Negative," I said. "That concrete hasn't been curing long enough. Company policy says 28 days minimum for load-bearing surfaces." "I don't care what the policy says," Harvey snapped. "I'm telling you to move that beam. The concrete tests came back fine." I pulled out my thermos and took a slow sip of coffee. The liquid was still hot, warming my chest against the morning chill that always lingered at this height. "What tests?" I asked, because I haven't seen any paperwork. There was a pause. In 34 years of construction work, I'd learned that pauses like that usually meant someone was scrambling to cover their tracks. "That's not your concern, Donovan. Your job is to operate the crane, not question my decisions." I set down the coffee and picked up the radio again. "My job is to operate this crane safely, and safely means following OSHA regulations and company policy. If you want that beam moved, show me the concrete strength reports." The radio went quiet for about 10 seconds. I watched Harvey through my binoculars. He was standing by the site trailer, and I could see his face getting red even from 150 feet up. The kid was used to people jumping when he barked orders. He wasn't used to someone with enough experience to know when those orders would get people killed. "Russ," he said. And now his voice had that dangerous edge to it that young supervisors get when their authority is challenged. "I'm going to say this one more time. Move the beam. That's a direct order from your project manager. And I'm going to say this one more time," I replied. "Show me the test results, or that beam stays on the ground." I'd been through this dance before with young supervisors who thought they knew better. Most of them would eventually back down when they realized I wasn't going to budge. But Harvey was different. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Fine," he said. "If you won't do your job, I'll find someone who will. You're fired, Donovan. Insubordination. Pack your tools and get off my site." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Fired. After 34 years of perfect safety record, after training half the crane operators in the city, After building half the skyline from up here in these cabs, after surviving 3 recessions, countless safety inspections, and more construction booms and busts than I could count. "You can't fire me over the radio," I said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into my own voice. "Watch me," Harvey shot back. "I'm calling the union hall right now, going to tell them you were acting erratically, showing signs of impairment. Security is on their way to escort you off the property." That's when I knew this wasn't just about the beam. Harvey was trying to destroy my career. An impairment charge would strip my crane operator's license. I'd never work construction again. My pension, my reputation, everything I'd built over 3.5 decades, gone. Helen and I had been planning for retirement in maybe 8 more years. We had grandkids coming to visit next month. I had responsibilities, bills, a life that depended on this job. I looked down at the construction site. There was Harvey, standing next to a security cart, pointing up at my cab. He looked so small from up here, like a toy figure on a model train set. But that toy figure had the power to ruin everything I'd worked for my entire adult life. I looked at my control panel, all systems green. The crane was purring like a satisfied cat, 150 feet of steel and hydraulics responding to my every command. I had maybe 10 minutes before security figured out how to get up to my cab, maybe 15 if they had to find the key to the elevator that ran up the tower mast. "You want me to stop working?" I asked into the radio. "I want you gone," Harvey said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He thought he'd won. "All right, Sterling, I'll stop working, but I've got one last lift to make." I didn't swing the boom toward the beam Harvey wanted moved. Instead, I swung it toward the stack of steel beams that had been delivered that morning. These were supposed to be premium-grade steel, the kind you use for the main structural supports. The invoices said we were paying premium prices for them. I'd seen the paperwork when it crossed my desk for material verification. But something had been bothering me about these beams for weeks. They looked different. The surface finish wasn't quite right, duller than it should have been, with what looked like patches where someone had tried to polish out imperfections. And when I'd lifted them during delivery, they seemed to flex more than they should have. A good crane operator develops a feel for materials over the years, the way a chef knows when meat is properly cooked just by touching it. These beams felt wrong. I lowered the spreader and locked onto one of the questionable beams. It was supposed to be a grade 50 structural steel beam, rated for 50,000 pounds per square inch minimum yield strength, the kind of steel that holds up skyscrapers. "Donovan, what are you doing?" Harvey's voice had lost its arrogance, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like panic. "Put that beam down. That's not on the schedule." "You fired me, remember?" I said into the mic. "I don't work for you anymore. I'm just conducting a little quality control test." I raised the beam to about 50 feet and held it there. From this height, every worker on the site could see what I was doing. Glenn Cooper, my apprentice, had stopped working and was looking up at me with confusion. Roger Miller, the site safety inspector, was walking over from the trailer with his clipboard. Then I did something that goes against every rule in the book, but which every experienced operator knows how to do when lives might be at stake. I applied lateral stress to the beam by swinging the boom slightly while maintaining the lift. It's a field test, not officially sanctioned, but effective for spotting substandard materials. The beam bent, not a little flex like you'd expect from any steel underload. It bent like a candy bar left in a hot car. A proper structural steel beam would have held its shape under that kind of stress, maybe shown a slight deflection at most. This one curved like a horseshoe. "Sweet mother of pearl," I whispered into the radio, forgetting it was still open. "These aren't structural grade. Put it down!" Harvey was screaming now, and I could hear real terror in his voice. "Put it down right now!" Instead, I lowered the bent beam right in front of the site entrance. It landed with a crash that shook the entire construction site and sent a cloud of dust into the air. The twisted metal lay there like a giant question mark, bent into a shape that made it impossible to miss or ignore. Every worker on the site stopped what they were doing and stared. Concrete finishers, electricians, welders, laborers. Everyone was looking at the pretzel-shaped piece of steel that was supposed to be holding up our building. "Did you see that?" I heard Glenn calling out to the other workers. "That beam just bent like it was made of aluminum foil." I swung the boom to block the entrance gate. Not maliciously, just positioned it so nobody could leave until someone in authority had seen what I'd discovered. Then I shut down the crane and pulled the ignition key out of the slot. The morning air was getting warmer now, and I could smell the diesel exhaust from the trucks lined up at the gate, the coffee brewing in the site trailer, and the concrete dust that perpetually hung in the air around any major construction project. "Come and get me," I said to Harvey over the radio. Then I opened the cab window. It was a small piece of plastic and metal, that ignition key, but when I tossed it out the window and watched it fall 150 feet to the ground below, the sound it made when it hit was like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. Getting down from a tower crane at 57 isn't the adventure it was when I was 30. My knees creaked with every step on the steel ladder, and my hands weren't as steady as they used to be on the rungs. But I took my time, thinking about what I'd just done. I'd probably destroyed my own career along with Harvey's. But sometimes a man reaches a point where he has to take a stand, consequences be damned. I thought about my granddaughter Emma, who was coming to visit next month. What kind of world was I leaving her if buildings fell down because people like Harvey Sterling were allowed to cut corners and endanger lives for profit? By the time I reached the ground, a crowd had gathered around the bent beam. Word travels fast on a construction site, especially when it involves something as dramatic as a structural beam folding like origami. I could hear the murmur of voices, the concern in their tone, and underneath it all, the growing anger of men who realized they'd been working in an unsafe building. "Russ!" Glenn Cooper jogged over to me, his face pale under his hard hat. "What the hell happened up there?" "That beam looks like somebody took a blowtorch to it. That beam is supposed to be holding up the 15th floor of this building," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "With people working in it every day, people with families, kids, futures." Roger Miller was crouched next to the bent beam with a measuring tape and his inspection gauge. He looked up at me with something close to horror in his eyes. "Russ," he said slowly, "this isn't even close to structural grade. The yield strength is maybe half of what it should be. If we'd put load on this..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Harvey appeared at my elbow, flanked by two security guards who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. His face was purple with rage, but there was something else there too. Fear. Raw, desperate fear. "You sabotaged company property," Harvey hissed at me, his voice shaking. "I'll have you arrested for destruction of property." That beam was worth $3,000. "I tested company property," I corrected him, gesturing at the twisted metal. "And it failed. Spectacularly. The question is, why are we using $500 scrap metal when we're paying $3,000 for structural grade steel?" Roger Miller stood up from his inspection, dusting off his knees. His face was grim. "Sterling, this beam is definitely not what we ordered. The metallurgy is all wrong. Look at this fracture pattern." He pointed to where the steel had bent. "This is consistent with recycled metal, not virgin structural steel." "That's impossible," Harvey stammered, fumbling with his clipboard. "I have the certificates right here. Grade 50 structural steel, certified by the supplier." "Let's see them," I said, crossing my arms. Harvey's hands were shaking as he flipped through the papers. I'd seen that look before, the look of a man who knows he's been caught but is still desperately hoping he can talk his way out of it. They're in the trailer," he said finally. "I'll get them." "No need to go anywhere," said a voice from behind us. I turned to see Norman Clark walking through the crowd of workers. Norman and I went way back. He used to be a welder until a trench collapse took his left leg and ended his construction career 15 years ago. The settlement money had put him through school for digital forensics and private investigation. We'd stayed in touch over the years, and I'd called him 3 days ago when I first started suspecting something was wrong with the steel deliveries. "Norman," I said, relief flooding through me, "please tell me you found something." "Oh, I found plenty," Norman said, limping over with his laptop bag. He looked directly at Harvey. "Interesting supply chain you've got set up here, Mr. Sterling." Harvey's face went white. "I don't know who you are, but you're trespassing on a private construction site." "Norman Clark, licensed private investigator," Norman said, pulling out his credentials. "And I'm here at the request of Mr. Donovan, who had some concerns about material quality." He opened his laptop. "Concerns that appear to be well-founded." The crowd of workers was growing. Word had spread through the site that something big was happening, and guys were abandoning their stations to see what was going on. I could see electricians, concrete finishers, iron workers, all gathering around to listen. "According to your company's purchase orders," Norman continued, "you've been buying premium structural steel from Apex Steel Supply at $2,800 per ton." But when I traced the actual deliveries, he clicked through several screens. The steel is coming from Reclaimed Metal Solutions in Mexico. They specialize in recycled scrap metal. That's a subsidiary company, Harvey said weakly. Same quality standards. Reclaimed Metal Solutions, Norman read from his screen, quote, providing low-cost recycled metal solutions for non-structural applications, end quote. They specifically warn against using their products for load-bearing construction. Glenn Cooper whistled low. So we've been building a 15-story office building with scrap metal? It gets better, Norman said. The invoices show your company paid $840,000 for premium steel over the past 6 months. But the actual purchases from the scrap dealer? $210,000. That's a profit margin of $630,000. The murmur from the crowd turned angry. These guys understood what that meant. Someone had been pocketing over $500,000 while putting their lives at risk every day. Where's that money going, Harvey? I asked quietly. Harvey tried to run. He actually turned and tried to push through the crowd of construction workers. But these were guys who'd been working 10-hour days on a dangerous site. Guys who'd been trusting their lives to steel that was apparently held together with hope and prayer. They weren't in a mood to let him go. "Whoa there, college boy," said Big Jim Patterson, an iron worker who stood about 6'4" and had arms like tree trunks. Harvey bounced off him like a tennis ball hitting a brick wall. Roger Miller had his phone out. "I'm calling the state building inspector," he said, "and OSHA. This entire structure needs to be evaluated immediately." "You can't do that," Harvey pleaded. "Think about the schedule. Think about the jobs. If you shut down this site, 200 people will be out of work." "If we don't shut down this site," I said, looking up at the steel skeleton rising above us, 200 people might be dead when this thing comes down in the first strong wind. That's when Harvey's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and his face went even whiter, if that was possible. "Uncle Richard?" he answered with a shaking voice. Even from where I was standing, I could hear the shouting coming through the phone. Harvey held it away from his ear, wincing. "No, sir." "Yes, sir. I can explain. It was supposed to be temporary. No, sir, the margins were—" He hung up and looked at all of us with the expression of a man who knows his world is about to end. "My uncle is on his way," he said quietly, "with the FBI. Norman chuckled. "Actually, they're probably already here. I called them yesterday after I traced the money trail. Fraud involving federal construction contracts is a serious matter." As if on cue, 3 black SUVs pulled through the site gate. Men in suits and windbreakers marked FBI got out, along with an older man in an expensive suit who looked like he wanted to strangle someone with his bare hands. "That would be Uncle Richard," Harvey whispered. Richard Sterling stalked over to where we were standing, his face purple with rage. He looked at the bent beam, at his nephew, at the crowd of workers, and at the federal agents walking behind him. "Harvey," he said in a voice that could cut steel, "you have exactly 30 seconds to explain to me why there are federal agents crawling all over my construction site." Harvey opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just pointed at the twisted beam lying in the dirt. Richard Sterling looked at the beam for a long moment. Then he looked at his nephew. Then he turned to the lead FBI agent. "Agent Morrison," he said with a sigh, "I believe you'll want to start with the purchasing records. The FBI investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, the entire construction site was shut down while structural engineers went through every beam, every weld, every piece of steel that Harvey had signed off on. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just the recent deliveries. Harvey had been running the scam for 8 months, replacing premium steel with recycled scrap and pocketing the difference. The total fraud came to $1.2 million. But the real cost was in the danger he'd created. 3 floors of the building had to be completely torn down and rebuilt with proper materials. I spent those 3 weeks on paid suspension while the company figured out what to do with me. Technically, I'd violated protocol by conducting an unauthorized stress test on company materials. But given what that test had revealed, nobody seemed eager to punish the guy who'd potentially saved hundreds of lives. Helen and I spent the time catching up on projects around the house, fixed the back porch, painted the guest bedroom, cleaned out 34 years' worth of construction gear from the garage. It felt good to work with my hands on something that was mine, something I didn't have to worry about some kid in a suit trying to cut corners on. "You did the right thing," Helen told me one evening as we sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset. I know you're worried about your job, but you couldn't have lived with yourself if that building had come down. She was right, of course. She usually was after 28 years of marriage. But I'd spent 34 years building my reputation in this city, and I wasn't sure there would be any construction companies willing to hire a 57-year-old crane operator who'd made national news for defying his supervisor. The news crews had picked up the story after the FBI raid. Construction worker exposes million-dollar fraud was the headline in the local paper. They painted me as some kind of hero, but I just felt like a guy who'd done what any experienced tradesman would do when he saw something dangerous. Norman kept me updated on the investigation. Harvey had tried to claim he was just following orders, but the FBI had traced the money trail directly to his personal bank accounts. He'd been gambling, it turned out, losing big at the casino boats and getting desperate to cover his debts. The steel fraud had started as a way to skim a little money, but it had spiraled out of control. The kid's looking at 5 to 10 years federal prison, Norman told me over coffee one morning. Fraud involving federal construction contracts, endangering public safety, money laundering. The prosecutors are throwing everything they can at him. What about his uncle? I asked. Richard Sterling is cooperating fully with the investigation. He's furious. Apparently Harvey was supposed to be learning the business from the ground up, but instead he nearly destroyed the company's reputation. Sterling Construction is facing lawsuits from every direction, but they're positioning themselves as victims of Harvey's fraud. 2 days later, I got a call from Richard Sterling himself. He wanted to meet with me at the company offices downtown. I dressed in my best clothes, the same suit I'd worn to my daughter's wedding, and drove to the gleaming office building that Sterling Construction called home. Richard Sterling was nothing like his nephew. He was in his early 60s, with calloused hands and the weathered face of a man who'd spent decades on construction sites before moving to the executive suite. His office was filled with photos of projects he'd built over the years: hospitals, schools, office buildings, real buildings that housed real people. "Mr. Donovan," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that told me he'd earned his way to the top. "I owe you an apology and a debt of gratitude." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Sterling. I just did my job." "No," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. "You did much more than your job. You potentially saved hundreds of lives and definitely saved my company's reputation. If that building had failed..." He shook his head. "The lawsuits alone would have destroyed us." He leaned back in his chair. "I want to offer you a position, Chief Safety Inspector for all Sterling Construction projects. You'd be responsible for training crane operators, overseeing material inspections, and making sure we never have another Harvey Sterling situation." The salary he quoted was 40% more than I'd been making as a crane operator. The benefits included full medical for Helen and me, plus a pension plan that would let us retire comfortably in 8 years. "There's one condition," he said. "I want you to develop a safety training program for the entire industry. Something that teaches young project managers to listen to experienced tradesmen. Something that prevents the kind of dangerous shortcuts Harvey was pushing." I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. "I accept." The Russell Donovan Construction Safety Initiative launched 6 months later. It's a training program that every project manager in the state is now required to complete before they can supervise a construction site. The program teaches them about materials, safety protocols, and most importantly, the value of listening to workers who've been doing the job longer than the managers have been alive. Harvey Sterling was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $1.4 million in restitution. He'll be 35 when he gets out, with a felony record that will keep him out of the construction industry forever. The building we were working on was completed 18 months later after the structural repairs were finished. It's a beautiful 15-story office complex that houses 800 people every day. Every beam in that building is certified premium structural steel. Every piece of concrete was allowed to cure for the full 28 days. Every safety protocol was followed to the letter. There's a plaque in the lobby that reads, "This building stands as a testament to the importance of construction safety and the courage of workers who refuse to compromise on quality." It doesn't mention my name, which is fine by me. The building itself is monument enough. I still work for Sterling Construction, though I don't climb cranes anymore. My knees are grateful for that. Instead, I spend my time training the next generation of operators and project managers. I teach them about wind loads and concrete strength and the weight limits of steel cables. But mostly, I teach them that when an experienced worker says something isn't safe, you listen. Because in construction, the difference between cutting corners and doing things right isn't measured in time or money. It's measured in lives. And some things, like the integrity of a building, the safety of workers, and the dignity of doing honest work, can't be bent, no matter how much pressure you apply. The steel that wouldn't bend became the foundation for everything that came after. And sometimes that's exactly what the world needs, something solid enough to build on. I learned that day that real strength isn't about how much weight you can lift or how high you can build. It's about standing firm when everything around you is telling you to bend, because some principles are worth more than any paycheck.